Let the past die. That's the only way to become what you were meant to be.
Darkness rises, and light to meet it.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
Come on! This is not going to go the way you think.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you?
I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
May the Force be with us.
My nerd road.
Just let it in.
Ojaba.
Why does she get a blaster and I do?
Ojaba.
Okay, so I'm going to give you this question, all right? You don't need to answer it yet. We'll address this in the second half of the podcast, but let me pose this question to you. Are you of the opinion that Disney and Lucasfilm would allow the Skywalker bloodline to end? And we'll tie it into episode 9, okay? Do you think that Lucasfilm and Disney, the story group, do you think that they would be willing to let the Skywalker bloodline finish and end? Now, I'll address the reason why I posed that question, again, in the later half of the podcast. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, John Justice. Glad I got sick this week, only because I had every intention of doing a show yesterday. And if I had, I would have missed the massive announcement that I was lying. I got this 24-hour bug, and it just took me out. It was awful, awful, awful. I'm feeling much, much better now, but you might hear a little bit in my voice. And so if you do, or if I've got a cough or whatever, I apologize up front. But I'm lying on the couch trying to recover, and I'm trying to find something to watch, and I put on YouTube on the TV, and there's the breaking news announcement that Disney and Lucasfilm are going to not only have a live-action TV show coming in 2019. I have no clue what that's going to be, by the way. We'll just get that out of the way. I don't want to talk much about the live-action TV show. We can save that for maybe next week's podcast or a slow news week. I have no idea what that live-action TV show is going to be. I know that George Lucas had written like 100 episodes for it was Star Wars Underworld, essentially, like gangster bounty hunter themed TV show. Some of those scripts have actually been used, I believe, in the Clone Wars, if I'm not mistaken. But I have no idea what that live action TV show is going to be, or what era it's going to be. It could be about existing characters. What I want to focus on, and we're going to get back to a bit of the Rey, Kylo, Reylo discussion, because it absolutely plays into the other, and in my opinion, bigger announcement, and that is that Rian Johnson is going to be the individual in charge of a brand new trilogy. He's going to write and direct at least the first one, but a brand new trilogy set in an era that hasn't been explored yet in another part of the galaxy. Okay, I have my theory based off, I have my theory and speculation on where it's going to be just based off of the evidence. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about, if not everything that we'll be talking about on the show, is just based off of not just speculation, but the evidence that we have that points to these certain things taking place. Okay, really excited about this. I believe that this new trilogy and the announcement of this new trilogy has huge implications for not only episode 8, but also episode 9. So we will get into all of that. Let me start here, however, because it all ties together. And actually, the whole point of Star Wars in and of itself is that it ties together. Rogue One was a standalone movie, but let's be honest, it was a part of Star Wars as a whole. Even as a standalone movie, it goes right into, Episode 4. So I mean, it is a standalone by itself, but it's still a part of the same universe. And I'm convinced that Disney and Lucasfilm are going to continue to do that. They'll continue to combine everything together. Okay. Right now, I am on my own journey to The Last Jedi. I didn't do this with Rogue One. I did do it with The Force Awakens, and I find it a lot of fun. Basically, I've mapped out, and I'm actually a week late, so I'm going to have to do one double feature. But I'm going to be watching all of the Star Wars movies from now until The Last Jedi, when I see it on December 14th. So last weekend, Friday, I watched The Phantom Menace. And I'm going to be watching Attack of the Clones today. And then next week, of course, Revenge of the Sith. The following week, I'm going to do a double feature of Rogue One and A New Hope. And then we'll do Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. And then and that'll lead me to the final weekend before The Force Awakens. And then on Wednesday, I'll watch The Force Awakens before going and seeing The Last Jedi. So, and like I said, I did this before The Force Awakens, and I found it to be a lot of fun. When I watched The Phantom Menace last weekend, I like the prequels. I like them for their flaws, but I love those movies. Okay, I'm not an apologist. I do understand they do have some problems, but I do love those films, and I've talked about the movies at length before. And if you go back and listen to previous podcasts, especially if you go back to 2015. You can hear me kind of go through a similar situation, and I talk about all these films. This was one of the most enjoyable experiences I had watching The Phantom Menace. When it comes to the prequel trilogy, you watch movies differently, at least I do. Sometimes you get wrapped up in the story and you follow the storyline, and other times, especially the prequel trilogy, I just like to take it all in. So when I go back and watch these movies now, it's like I'm looking at a book, and I look at a lot of the different Star Wars books. I was just looking at the Rogue One the visual guide, which is fantastic, the visual dictionary, which is great. The art books, I love looking at them. When I watch these movies, there are times when I watch it and I get into the story, and there's times when I just take in everything that's going on and just look at all the different details that are put into it. And I did that with The Phantom Menace and just really, really enjoyed it. And I'm really excited to watch Attack of the Clones today. And the fun thing about doing my own little journey to The Last Jedi is that every weekend I kind of have something to look forward to, because I'm making myself wait to watch the movies. And so I've been looking forward to, despite being sick, and I could have watched it when I was sick, but I'm like, no, I'm going to wait. I'm going to act like Attack of the Clones is coming out Friday, and I'm going to watch it on Friday. So here's my point on The Phantom Menace before we get into all the new news that dropped. I came to a realization watching that movie, and I've come to a rather, not a conclusion, because I already felt this way, but it makes way more sense to me watching The Phantom Menace. When you look at the sequel trilogy, it makes way more sense that the sequel trilogy and Rey's role in that would be more like The Phantom Menace than it would be the original trilogy. So everybody goes and compares how The Force Awakens was a rehash of A New Hope, right? Everybody complains about this. Not everybody, but the people that complain about The Force Awakens, they say it was a rehash. And it really was kind of it was a combination of a lot of the different things from the original trilogy. That's what it was designed to do. The sequel trilogy was always going to be different because Lucas wasn't going to be attached to it. The prequels and the original trilogy, there are so many different things, and if you subscribe to the ring theory, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, just go Google Star Wars ring theory and you can read up on it for yourself. But Lucas created something genuinely special with those 6 movies. The sequel trilogy was always going to be different because it was going to be helmed by other individuals. But to the larger picture, if you're looking at these pictures as 9 movies as a whole, it makes more sense to me that Rey is a nobody doing that thing with my fingers than a Skywalker. It makes way more sense that she would be more akin to Anakin being born of the Force and fulfilling the prophecy, and that Rey would be essentially something similar. she would be rising up from the Force, maybe not born of the Force, but she is given the gift of the Force, or is that person to rise up against the evil that is rising in the galaxy. It makes more sense that her journey would mirror Anakin from the Phantom Menace than it does that it would mirror Luke Skywalker and her to be a Skywalker from the original trilogy. And again, you just go based off the evidence, that makes way more sense to me. Looking at the 9 movies as a whole, it makes more sense that here you have another individual who was essentially chosen by the Force. The lightsaber called to her. And the lightsaber in the Phantom Menace was the original MacGuffin of the movie. It was way more apparent that the lightsaber was going to Rey. We still got that in the Phantom Menace when she opens the chest and she has the vision in Maz Kanata's castle, and of course the lightsaber choosing to fly into her hand. I mean, you can interpret that, and I think JJ kind of left it open for Rian Johnson to play with. You can interpret that Rey was more powerful than Kylo in that moment, and the lightsaber went to her. But make no mistake, Kylo was certainly stronger in the Force and was supposed to be more in tune, and the lightsaber ended up choosing Rey in that moment. So that's my quick point on that is that fact. That to me, looking at the trilogy again as a whole 9 movies, it makes way more sense that Rey would be the light side of the Force coming to balance out the Force like Anakin was in the original trilogy, in the prequel trilogy. Okay. Now, this also plays into what I talked to last week about Reylo and sort of Kylo being the inverse of what Anakin Skywalker was, right? And that the relationship that could potentially happen between Rey and Kylo in the sequel trilogy could succeed where Anakin and Padme failed. And again, doesn't that make the entire 9-movie arc make a heck of a lot more sense? And I'll take it a step further and dive right into this new trilogy. The Sith were extinct for a millennium, right? That was according to the Jedi in the Phantom Menace. It's spoken in the movie. When Palpatine, right, begins to put forward his plans to take over the Senate, right? At last we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi. At last we will have our revenge. You can look at that and say, okay, here's the prophecy. Anakin, born of the Force, was born some 9 years before, probably right around when Palpatine began his rise and began plotting his rise to have the Sith regain power again. If they had been extinct for a millennium, and here comes Palpatine, weaseling his way into politics to have the Sith gain control again, it makes sense that the Force would bring about a balance in Anakin Skywalker to try to go and remedy everything. Now, this also makes a lot of sense if you begin to look at The Last Jedi and what could have potentially caused the problem and what Luke potentially finds out in The Last Jedi. We know he has the old books. We know he's at the first Jedi temple. I believe he discovers, again, that the prophecy wasn't a one-time deal, right? That the prophecy was one where whenever there is a rise of dark, the light will come back to go and balance things out. In the trailer that I played, and that was a brand new TV spot that we played at the beginning of the show, you hear Snoke saying, the darkness rises and the light to meet it. So again, if, for the sake of argument, Anakin was born of the Force, and we'll say that rather than midichlorians because people get weird off midichlorians, be that as it may, it was the Force. If Anakin was born as the Force to fulfill the prophecy, and his coming into existence was in direct correlation with the rise of Palpatine, and the original trilogy gives us things got messed up for a while, right? Skywalker enters into the mix to go and work with stuff, right? Okay, being the offspring of Anakin. It makes sense that Rey would be brought about by the Force to counter the rise of the First Order, which would also somewhat coincide with the timing, because right around when Rey comes about was probably right around when the First Order begins to come into prominence. There's a very brief period of time after Palpatine bites the big one on the Death Star 2 at the hands of his father, and the prophecy is fulfilled. You have a very small period of time where you would have, we'll say for the lack of a better term, balance. Okay? Except for the fact, right, that Luke being out there on his own, and Luke being the last Jedi, and the Sith having fallen, for lack of a, having gone away, having done with Darth Vader, redeems himself, Force Ghost guy, Palpatine's dead. That brief period of time, you just have a Jedi, which you could argue brings about the rise of the First Order, which subsequently brings about the rise of a new light side element in Rey to go and combat it. Okay, so I presented that idea. Let's get back to, just for a moment, the Sith have been extinct for a millennia. All right, hold that thought. The announcement we got, Rian Johnson is going to be directing a brand new trilogy set in a different part of the galaxy at a time and place where that's been unexplored. When will that take place is obviously the big question. Okay, first off, let's just say up front, Disney must be pretty happy with The Last Jedi if they've handed Rian Johnson a brand new trilogy. And we'll get into Disney's ideas of what this is supposed to be, and how this plays out with the timeline of all the movies in and of itself, and the ramifications that this has for The Last Jedi, in my opinion. But they must be awfully happy with The Last Jedi to hand Rian Johnson these movies. I also think this is why Rian Johnson is not doing 9, right? Because he's going to be busy beginning work on this new trilogy and is going to want to take some time off. I also think that what I'm about to lay out explains why J.J. Abrams is doing 9. I have a very specific reason why I think J.J. Abrams is doing 9, and why Colin Trevorrow was booted off of 9. I think a part of why Colin Trevorrow was booted off of 9 was that he's not a very nice person to work with, but I also think they brought back J.J. Abrams specifically, and I can't help but wonder if J.J. Abrams didn't offer up to do it himself. J.J. Abrams said that he was almost jealous that he wasn't directing The Last Jedi. J.J. Abrams knows what happens in The Last Jedi, and I think J.J. Abrams wants to close out this sequel trilogy for a very specific reason, and it has to do with what he set up in The Force Awakens. Now, that may seem like the obvious statement, but it's a heck of a lot more obvious when you begin to go and look at the whole Reylo theory. Okay, so let me get back to that in a moment. I've got a whole list here, and I'm trying to keep things on a linear path here, so we're not jumping back and forth so much. All right, so where will this new trilogy that Rian Johnson is going to take place? Okay, let's look at the options. Okay, so the options really are post Episode 9, pre The Phantom Menace. Anything that they would attempt to do, in my opinion, within the prequel trilogy or original trilogy or sequel trilogy timeline, anything between Episode 1 and 9, to do anything at any part of the galaxy in the middle when all that's going on, to me, that comes off as way too confusing. And how do you escape the battle that's raging, whether it's the Clone Wars, whether it's the original trilogy era, the Empire? I mean, I don't see that happening. So I'm going to take out a trilogy taking place anywhere between Episode 1 and Episode 9. I'm also going to take out anything after Episode 9. And I'll explain why in a moment. Seems pretty obvious, but I'll explain why in a moment. So that leaves one thing and one thing only. Something prior to The Phantom Menace Episode 1. And in my opinion, it goes right back to one quote by Kai Audi-Mundi. And I'm pretty sure it was Kai Audi-Mundi. If I'm wrong on that, I apologize. But the one quote from The Phantom Menace: "The Sith have been extinct for a millennium." I think that Rian Johnson is going to go back and we're going to visit the Old Republic era. There is so much to be mined from that era. When you look at how the Sith came into prominence, when you look at the original Jedi Order, when you look at how the rule of two came about when it comes to the Sith? Because according to lore, the Sith had an army. All that stuff has been left to legends now. We don't have anything canon, as far as I know, pre the Phantom Menace. And doesn't it make all the sense in the world that Rian Johnson, who we know was tasked with finding out why Luke Skywalker was on Ahch-To, being the first Jedi Temple, those books in the trailer, and having Luke potentially, and again, I'm guessing, but having Luke find out the history of the Jedi, and that the Jedi currently, or that in its form, I should say, in the prequel trilogy, was doing it all wrong, doesn't it make all the sense in the world that Rian Johnson would go, hey, why don't I tell the stories of, where those books came from? Why don't I go back and tell those stories with brand new characters of what took place a millennium before the Phantom Menace? And that's easily conveyed to the audience a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, before Palpatine, before Skywalker. The Jedi and Sith were at war. Because when they made this announcement, they made it sound like the way they worded it was they were very specific to say this is not going to take place during the Skywalker era. This is not going to be attached to the Skywalkers. So I've heard some people already in the past 24 hours extrapolating that this is going to be something separate in another corner of the universe and some new stories with some new people. And somebody even suggested that there's no Jedi and lightsabers, and I absolutely disagree with that. Sure, they made it work with Rogue One, but there was still an attachment to A New Hope that took place. To go and make a trilogy based off of a bunch of individuals where you don't have the elements of the things that we love doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You need to have some mythology there, right? And why wouldn't you go and mine the mythology that exists already? I mean, why wouldn't you go back? And again, just based off the evidence, not going to be post Episode 9, not going to be between 1 and 9, so you go pre the Phantom Menace, and why, if that's the option and the best option, based off of what we know, then yeah, that's where they are going to, that's where that Rian Johnson is going to land. And then if you go back far enough, I mean, if you go back a millennium, right, you go back 1,000 years to tell those stories, I mean, look at what you've opened up. I mean, if you look at Star Wars in a perpetuity type of mentality, you've now created a new trilogy based off of a whole new set of people and still deeply entrenched with the lore that we've all come to love within the original saga films. It makes all the sense in the world. It doesn't make sense to me to go off to some remote part of the galaxy where you don't have any Sith, you don't have any Jedi, you don't have any of this mythology to attach yourself to. It just becomes some other adventure movie. There has to be something there, right? Okay, so let me look at my list here. All right, so let's look at the timeline here of when this takes place, because this plays into greatly my thoughts on how this affects episodes 8 and 9. All right, so we get The Last Jedi this year. Next year we're getting Han Solo, so 2018. And then 2019 we're going to get Episode 9, right? Okay, so that puts us at 2020 potentially for a new movie. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that we get this much talked about Obi-Wan Kenobi movie in 2020, okay? There'll obviously be a Star Wars movie a year. I think they're moving to 2 Star Wars movies a year, and I'll explain why in a moment. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that we get an Obi-Wan Kenobi movie in 2020. And let's go ahead and say, for the sake of argument, and we'll just put it 2020 or 2021. 2020 or 2021 is the first potential years that we could get this new Rian Johnson helmed trilogy. Okay? So, if you put it, for the sake of argument, at 2021, that gets us, if they do it every year, if they do one a year, right? Or actually, no, let's not do that. Let's do one every 2 years. That makes more sense, right? Okay, I did my math wrong. Okay, so let's say it's 2021 for episode 1 of the new Rian Johnson trilogy, right? So we'll say NT, episode 1 of the NT, new trilogy. So then you go 2021, you go 2023, and then you go 2025, right? So if you put a year in between, which is what they've been doing for these new saga films. Okay, so that puts us out at 2026 without any movies. Doesn't it make all the sense in the world to then bring back the original Star Wars saga films? Okay, so let's back up for a moment. What impact does the new trilogy have on episode 8 and episode 9? Okay, it has an impact because Kathleen Kennedy last week said that they were exploring new films that will involve Finn, Rey, Poe, and BB-8. Okay, so let's say those are not going to be standalone movies. I don't believe, personally, that Disney is willing to give up the Skywalker bloodline and the saga movies. Okay, those are the core of the Star Wars franchise. Now, okay, they could end. My wife disagrees with me. They could very easily end the Skywalker bloodline with Episode 9, and we'll get to that, okay? They could end it with Episode 9, and then that's it. Episodes 1 through 9, that's the Star Wars saga, and then everything else we get from that is apart from those movies. I don't think Disney's going to do that. I think the Skywalker name and I think that bloodline is way too important to the franchise in and of itself. What I think is going to happen is I think they're going to continue that bloodline, which has massive implications for episodes 8 and 9. I think they'll continue that bloodline, and what I think they're going to do is we're going to get this new trilogy. I think we're going to get new standalone movies. I think we're going to go to 2 movies a year. You'll have a standalone that happens in May, and then you'll have a new trilogy movie that happens in December. I think that Rian Johnson is going to create this whole new cast of characters that they can go and play with. And if it works, they can continue doing it. Okay? If they want to, by the time this new trilogy is done, they can then go back and bring back Rey and bring back Poe and bring back Finn for another round of saga films and continue with the saga movies. Now, they could very easily get rid of the idea of standalone movies altogether. And if they did, the new trilogy films make all the sense in the world because they've essentially got the best of both worlds. Rian Johnson could create this new trilogy, and it could be completely separate. It will be completely separate from the Skywalker saga, and in and of itself will be a standalone trilogy, but then they get the best of both worlds. Because I think Disney understands the power of having those running storylines. Disney understands how crucial it is that they have movies where fans can go and speculate what's going to happen next. What is going to happen in the next movie? I mean, seriously, think about all the conversations and podcasts, let alone, I'm on episode number 99 of Star Wars podcasts, where a majority of these have been talking about our expectation for this movie that comes out in about a month from now, and the lineage of the individuals involved. Rian Johnson is a fantastic storyteller. We're going to find that out in The Last Jedi. If you've seen these other movies, you know this. He's great with character work. I think the whole point of him creating a new trilogy is the opportunity for them to potentially build a new saga based off of his movies. And I think it still works to go and put it pre The Phantom Menace, because you have such a huge timeline of which you can go and work from before you even come close to the events of Phantom Menace. And then even if you wanted to, you can actually go and eventually tell that story of Palpatine at some point in time and Darth Maul and how did they end up where they are. I mean, if they set the stage and go back and have Rian Johnson start it there, they've got they've generations of stories that they can tell. But here's my other thing back to the Skywalker saga. If you keep the Skywalker bloodline, then once this new trilogy is done, you can go back and start a new trilogy that is a part of this of the saga, right? Episodes 10, 11, 12. And the audience is ready for it. So, and I jumped ahead because I didn't really flesh out my whole point of why Disney would also choose to do something pre The Phantom Menace. When you think about the audience and who Disney is tapping into, the generations growing up with the movies right now, not me, we'll be long gone before all these movies are done, but the generations that are growing up with Star Wars now, my kids, people like Sam on my show who are in their 20s, they're being exposed to the sequel trilogy, also maybe grew up on the prequel trilogy. The original trilogy is becoming a distant memory to them, right? So it makes sense that they would do Old Republic stuff pre The Phantom Menace because that's closer in the minds of the viewers and the core audience as they get older. It also makes sense that you have and you revisit the Skywalker stories some 6 or 7 years or 8 years down the line, because I think Disney knows the power of taking a break from the Skywalker story. So you do this new trilogy, you put a distance of, 6 or 7 years on it, and then we have a brand new trilogy, a brand new story, and hey, look, it's Rey. Hey, look, it's Poe. Hey, look, it's BB-8. Just like we all did with The Force Awakens. Okay, so again, new trilogy taking place before The Phantom Menace. You have this new trilogy to fill the gap and create a gap so that Star Wars can and Disney and Lucasfilm can let the Star Wars and the Skywalker saga specifically, this is not Star Wars, the Skywalker saga, take a break, give them a new trilogy, new people to get to know, and then once you get that trilogy done, you hit them upside the head with nostalgia, tap into that nostalgia, but the nostalgia now isn't the original trilogy. The nostalgia now is the sequel trilogy. And then you bring back Rey, you bring back Poe, you bring back Finn, you potentially bring back Kylo. Okay, so now that I've laid all of that out, let's get into a bit of how Reylo fits into all of this.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, so let's go there. To the question, will Disney Lucasfilm let the Skywalker bloodline die? Okay, if they're willing to let the Skywalker bloodline die, then kind of anything's possible, right? You can kill off Kylo Ren. Rey doesn't have to be a Skywalker, and it just ends. I don't think that's what they're going to do. I just cannot fathom that Disney would not leave themselves the option to continue to tell Skywalker stories. Okay, I just don't think that they're going to do that. Okay, so let's just go under the assumption that Disney and Lucasfilm will not let the Skywalker bloodline die. Okay, that leaves us with two options. Okay, option number one. Rey is Luke Skywalker's daughter. Okay? All right, so that's option one. Option number two. Rey is a nobody, which, in my opinion, would make her essentially a child of the Force in some way, shape, or form. She could have a mommy and a daddy, but I think still that the Force is calling to her to bring balance. And she has to have a kid with Ben Solo. To me, that makes the most sense in the world. For her to be a Skywalker, and this is possible, but for her to be Luke Skywalker's daughter, if you want to revisit that, then in the time frame between when Episode 9, and again, this is all assuming they're going to do more saga films down the road. Okay, so I'm just going off of a lot of assumptions here. I do believe they're going to. And the fact that Kathleen Kennedy said there'll be further stories with Rey, with Finn, with Poe, I think tells us that they're planning on doing movies with those characters. So it makes sense that they would go and revisit the timeline. If they're going to revisit the timeline after 9, why do you revisit that timeline after 9 if it's not going to be with those characters? Okay, so if she's a Skywalker, then she has to find somebody else to hook up with and then have kids with, right? So I guess you could argue that maybe she meets somebody in Episode 9 because you're not going to want to go into Episode 10 7 years, or 8 or 9 years from now and find out that Rey met some dude and they already have kids. You're going to want those kids to be established. Okay. So, to me, the most logical way to, and the best way to keep the Skywalker bloodline intact is, once again, it's Kylo's redemption, and Ben, when he's redeemed, he becomes Ben, right? And Ben and Rey end up together. Now, that's not without Kylo Ren going through some stuff in order to make that happen. And I was talking with my wife about this, and how do you redeem Kylo Ren to Ben to the point where Rey ends up accepting him enough to have a kid and get married to him? Well, it's Star Wars. You can do it. Again, Anakin was redeemed after killing a bunch of children. We forgot about it. But, I think if you lop off a limb, if you lop off one of Kylo's limbs, and you have him essentially take out Snoke, who we just assume is going to be the big bad, and you, through the storytelling, learn to accept that Kylo can't get to where he is to take out the big bad guy without having killed his father, and it makes his father's death worthy. Because if you don't, and I'll say it again, if you don't redeem Kylo Ren, it makes Han Solo's death pointless. If you kill off Kylo Ren without having him be redeemed, it makes kind of the whole Skywalker legacy pointless. I mean, how sad is that? I know Luke Skywalker is there, but, Luke now at this point, as we know, is kind of a broken dude. The Academy failed. I think Luke's success and Luke's almost redemption is going to be having figured out what the Jedi did wrong and putting Rey in a situation where Kylo Ren, Ben Solo / Skywalker, and Rey are the ones that write everything together by bringing the balance back. That's what I think Luke discovers. Luke finds out that this is what this is what he should do. I think his reluctance, because we know there's some reluctance that Luke has in training Rey, I think that reluctance in training Rey is stemming from the fact that he doesn't think that he's capable of doing it. And I think what brings him around is he realizes, well, if it's not going to be him, then who? And maybe he doesn't realize quite yet how Kylo plays into this, how Ben Solo plays into this. And so his redemption is he gets it right in helping to fix the universe by setting Rey on the right path. While at the same time, Kylo becomes redeemed to Ben, kills the big bad guy, and therefore ends up wrapping up the Skywalker portion of these 9 movies on an up note. Because it has to all end on an up note. It can't all end in my opinion, you can't have the Skywalker legacy end with Kylo's bad and then gets killed without some type of redemption taking place. Look, I suppose you can make an argument that it happens the same way it does in Return of the Jedi, where he ends up killing the big bad but sacrifices himself in the end. But then, to me, that's tragic. That's tragic as well. With the end of Return of the Jedi, you still had Luke there. Luke fulfilled his destiny, and we forget that too. That Luke fulfills his destiny at the end of Return of the Jedi. Everything else is kind of extra. What Luke discovers is this whole battle is going to continue in the galaxy if somebody doesn't go and get it right. And in order to get it right, you have to have both sides. You have to have the light and the dark. Now, that being said, moving off of Reylo for just a moment, there is a possibility here that the two of these individuals need to exist, but they need to exist in different places, in which case you can make Rey a Skywalker. But Luke also realizes that if you get one or the other, then you are going to just inevitably bring about the rise of one. So if you kill Snoke and you get rid of Kylo, eventually the dark side is just going to rise again. You need to have a balance. And without knowing what that mythology is actually going to be, it's a little bit difficult to completely lay out how that would work. Which again is why it makes way more sense to me that you wrap the trilogy up with Redemption and those two getting together. So that way, when you get to episode 10, you have more stories to tell because now you have potentially new Skywalker children. And new Skywalker children that can go on their own journeys. All right, so before we wrap up the show this week, a couple more points. One, it also makes sense just based off the evidence that Rian Johnson, in the middle of making The Last Jedi, is when this whole idea for going back to the Old Republic came about. And when you look at some of the mythology that they've been bringing to the forefront, the Jedi books in The Last Jedi trailer and in the movie, Journal of the Wills, the bringing in the Wills into Rogue One. To me, it makes sense that they've been providing new glimpses into the past to lay the foundation for those movies of Rian Johnson to do. And if Rian Johnson was indeed in charge of looking at, well, what do we do? How do we look at what happened pre The Phantom Menace to apply it to this new story and Luke's journey? What does he discover in looking at the Journal of the Wills and the Jedi before The Phantom Menace? It makes sense that he could have developed in his mind a story to take place before The Phantom Menace to tell the background of the Journal of the Wills and the Sith of old and the Jedi of old and how they all ended up coming about in the first place. So the other part to this too that I wanted to mention is J.J. Abrams doing Episode 9. Going back to J.J. Abrams' comments on The Force Awakens, and this gets back to Reylo again, equating the Rey and Kylo to, a prince and a princess, a beauty and the beast, and those parallels that we got into in last week's show. I think that J.J. Abrams saw what Rian Johnson was putting forward in The Last Jedi and where it was going, and I think J.J. Abrams wants to wrap it up. I think J.J. Abrams wants to be the one to go and tell the story of Reylo. I think he is perfect for it. He's great with those characters. He started with those characters. And if he started with the idea that this was always going to be a part of the plan, which was Kylo's redemption story, the redemption arc, Rey being the light come to meet it, and it was all about the balance, and it was going to be these two individuals coming together, then it makes all the sense in the world that J.J. Abrams may have even asked when Colin Trevorrow got pitched off of Episode 9, he may have even said, look, I know what Rian Johnson's going to do. Let me come in and finish the story of these two characters. People have complained that J.J. Abrams is not a good closer. I think he's going to knock it out of the park with this one. Look, as with all my speculation, I could be completely wrong. But I think there's a lot of evidence that points to all of these things coming true, especially when it comes to Rian Johnson in this new trilogy. Man, I just know that we're getting a ton of Star Wars movies, and I can't wait to see The Last Jedi now. Every week I seem to get more and more excited. And look, regardless of whether or not it's Reylo or not, or she is a Skywalker or not, I think we're in for year after year after year for as long as we're all alive of Star Wars films, and that's amazing to me, because there was a time when I didn't think that was ever going to happen. Thanks to everybody who's been leaving comments, especially on YouTube for the podcast. I really, really do appreciate it. You can always drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Talkshownerd@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed the show again this week. I'll be back, hopefully, again next week with, I don't know what we're going to get between now and then. I don't know. Well, you know what? We can talk live action. Live action. My hopes for a live action TV show and what that could potentially look like. So, until next week, may the Force be with you always.